resuming with Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Matthew, Lecture 2. Steiner now begins to go into a kind of occult esoteric history of Moses and the life of Moses, because as we had seen last time, he had gone into, because of Matthew's genealogy, at the begin, right at the beginning of the Gospel, he had gone into his esoteric history of the Turanians and the Iranians and the two streams from Atlantis that went north and became the Turanians and then went south across North Africa to wind up in India and Persia, and a mixture of the two then coming together in both places. So now recall that he had accepted the date for Zarathustra. The Greeks gave him about roughly 6000 BC as the founder of the second of his post-Atlantean epochs, the Persian. The first would have been founded by Manu, the Indian epoch. So we have Zarathustra, and Zarathustra had two pupils that were especially important to him, both of which received incarnations of his etheric body and his astral body when they reincarnated later on as the two individualities known as Tot, or Hermes, as the Greeks called him, the founder for Steiner of the third of his epochs, the Egypto-Chaldean epoch, and then later with Moses. And then he says that now Tot is a deity. Hermes was a deity as far as we know, and so was Tot. The Egyptians equated them because they were both gods of writing and bringers of culture and the arts. But for Steiner, Tot apparently was a real individuality. And so the kind of wisdom that that we had seen that Zarathustra had of the sun as a primary divinity, the divinity Ahura Mazda, or as the outer covering of what inhabited the sun as a divinity named Ahura Mazda, is for Steiner the Christ being. It's the same being, he says, that Zarathustra recognized. Ahura Mazda is the Christ being. And so the sun wisdom that he had was passed along via his etheric body to Tot Hermes, who later then reincarnates and founds about 3000 BC or so the Egypto-Chaldean civilization. And this is a kind of sun wisdom that he inherits, and it's a wisdom of space. It's spatially oriented. It's a wisdom of how things and gods and deities are situated in space. And of course, the sun is the primary deity for the Egyptians, other than Osiris, who's associated with the moon. But I think the sun, with the sun god Re and all of his various transformations into Re Harakti and Amun Re and so forth, is the primary divinity, especially in the time of Akhenaten, who transformed the sun disk into the only allowable deity to be worshipped. So Tot Hermes then inherits this sort of spatial knowledge of the sun wisdom of Zarathustra, the wisdom of the sun, and how cosmic energy streams down to the earth. And then Moses, on the other hand, he says, receives his astral body, Zarathustra's astral body, when he reincarnates and is born in Egypt. And this is a knowledge now of time, not so much of space, but Moses inherits his knowledge of time, and this imparts to Moses a kind of earth wisdom in contradistinction to the sun wisdom of the Egyptians, of Tot Hermes. This is now an earth wisdom, which confers on Moses his peculiar historical consciousness that lends to the Hebrews the stamp of a very historical consciousness where it matters how earlier things are the causes of later things. This, of course, leads to his knowledge of the evolution of the earth with the book of Genesis and the unfolding there. Steiner has a lecture cycle on Genesis. That reminds me, I want to do that one too at some point. So Moses inherits his temporal knowledge of earth wisdom and how things unfold over time. Now, at one point in Steiner's cosmogony, we had seen during Old Sun how earth and sun were united together and eventually split apart. So too, he says, now we have the sun wisdom of Tot Hermes that the Egyptians maintain, and then Moses incarnates specifically in Egypt with this earth wisdom that he's inherited via the etheric body of Zarathustra. And so now the two have to be united for a time, which is the reason why Moses has to be born amongst the Egyptians and spends his childhood there and a great part of his early adulthood there as well, possibly, as Freud hypothesizes, as a priest in the court of Akhenaten, who transformed, as we said, the sun into the Atun disk, the only allowable disk to be worshipped, and possibly got from him the idea for monotheism. So he's there for a long time and absorbing this sun wisdom. And then when he leaves with the Exodus, then that phase is over with, and then he begins to spread the earth wisdom. He begins to inflect it. Now, Steiner has this very strange idea, uh, not unusual coming from Rudolf Steiner, about how cosmic energy radiates down spiritual energy from the sun to the earth, but the earth also radiates spiritual energy back up to it. And so, in a certain sense, Moses inheriting the sun wisdom from Zarathustra is the movement of inheriting the sun wisdom, but now it has to radiate back, and it does so characteristically for Moses historically toward the sun. He's been born amongst the Egyptians and absorbed them. And now Steiner says, imagine this in terms of space, in terms of planetary bodies, which often mirror cosmic events, which is that if this earth wisdom had radiated back out into space from the earth, it would first have ascended to the sphere of Mercury. Now, this is, of course, the old Ptolemaic cosmology, and I don't know if you've seen my series on Rudolf Steiner's book, The Spiritual Hierarchies, where he goes into all the detail about his cosmic hierarchies and how he sort of saves the Ptolemaic cosmology just by transposing the names for Mercury and Venus and saying that in the Ptolemaic cosmology, of course, it went Earth, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun. That was the Ptolemaic ascent of the soul through the spheres as it ascended up through then Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn to the Empyrean. So Steiner accepts the Copernican cosmology with the exception that he thinks that the names were at some point, and I'm not sure when, but some point after the Christ event, amongst esotericists, the names were changed so that the planet that it would now ascend to would be Mercury, that Venus is actually closest to the sun, not Mercury. The same planets, of course, but the names are different. So that it would ascend through Mercury and then ascend through Venus, this earth wisdom, and then ascend through the sun. And so Steiner says then that this is mirrored in Moses's historical ascent through time, radiation, let's say, through time, to first the Mercury, the equivalent of the Mercury sphere for Steiner is David. David is a major figure in the Hebrew, of course, the United Monarchy, but David was a literary man. He wrote the Psalms. He played the harp. Of course, we know that the lyre was connected to Hermes. And so David was a learned man, or at least whatever passed for erudition in his time. So this represents the ascent of Moses' earth wisdom as it moves across historically to David/Mercury. And then the Venus, the ascent toward Venus then doesn't happen until the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews have been taken captive by the Babylonians in, 586 BC or so, and they're completely displaced. The north, Israel, has been overtaken by the Assyrians in the 8th century under Tiglath-Pileser III, who was notable in warfare history for being the first to uproot and deport entire populations from their homelands. A very clever strategy for demoralizing a people, remove them from their homelands. And that was it for Israel. And then, of course, Judah in the south, with only 2 tribes remaining, is then conquered by the Babylonians in 586 and then taken captive to Babylon, which is probably fortunate in a way because so many of the Sumerian myths were inherited there and applied by these priestly scribes, which is why we have the flood myth in the book of Genesis, which is transmigrated from Gilgamesh, or the Atrahasis, why we have a tree with a garden and a sacred keeper of it. All of that comes from Sumerian mythology via this Babylonian captivity. And so this is the Venus phase, the inheritance of the arts, the exposure to the Babylonian captivity and Babylonian literary artistry and so forth. This would be the Venus phase. And then he says it finally sort of ping-pongs back to Zarathustra and back ultimately to the sun, in that Zarathustra had a reincarnation during this period. And this date, 500 BC, about the time of Darius, is traditional among scholars for the date of the historical Zarathustra. And Steiner puts him right here, but it says that he was actually a Babylonian priest who went by the name of Zarathos. So Zarathos inherits this sort of Moses wisdom, and so there's this process of the reunion of the sun wisdom, the wisdom of the cosmic energies, and the earth wisdom with its historical evolutionary unfoldment together. And then so this is what produces the historical Moses and lays the foundations for the Hebrews as a people. And he says also that insofar as we look back at the origins of the Hebrews as a people, via his earlier timeline that we had talked about in the first lecture, with the sinking of Atlantis and the migration then of peoples north across Europe, who then go across the Black and the Caspian Sea regions to the Oxus and Jaxartes regions, and those become the Turanians, as we have seen, and then another group who went south, migrated across North Africa. And these, as I said last time, neatly correspond to Spengler's designation of Turan for the Indo-Aryans and of Atlantis for the megalith builders from Ireland down through Spain and then across North Africa to Egypt. But then Steiner has these peoples continuing on into India. And of course, with Spengler, we have the Kosh cultural amoeba, the Neolithic cultural amoeba that's situated from India across the Persian Gulf to East Africa. And determinism. But then Steiner says, so the Hebrews then originate at the point where the Turanians intersect in the Middle East with the wave that's gone, the Atlanteans who have gone over North Africa. I'm not sure what he's referring to by their intersection. It may be the Hyksos. The Hyksos, as far as we know, were either Semites or a mixture of Indo-Aryans and Semites, but in any event, they conquered the Egyptians simply with the innovations of the compound bow and arrow and the two-wheeled horse chariot, about 1700 BC until about 1500 BC or so, right about there for about 200 years. And indeed, some of the earliest Hebrew names do occur on the register of their kings. The name Jacob is there as Jacob El, who is one of the rulers of the Hyksos in the Nile Delta. They ruled in the north, not the south. And so, at any event, Steiner says that the Hebrews then emerge out of this confluence. And whereas the Atlanteans had pure spiritual clairvoyance and were able to look out into space, and it was a sort of from center to periphery or outward going clairvoyance, where they could peer into the immensity of space and so forth, and which had become, Steiner says, that clairvoyance had become degenerate amongst the culturalist Turanians, was revived by the Hebrews, but turned around inward. So that the clairvoyance which the Hebrews activated was a kind of inward turned clairvoyance that turned inward and actually acted on their physical bodies and on their blood. And it created a kind of, number one, the transmission of the ego through the bloodline, which is absolutely essential for the Hebrew world, the Hebrew ethnicity. And the other for this idea that this internal clairvoyance turning inward produced this idea of Jehovah or Yahweh as a kind of invisible divinity, monotheistic but invisible, as Elijah experiences when he ascends Mount Horeb, and there's all these storms and phenomena around him, but God isn't in any of those things, only in the still small voice that he hears inside of his head. And so this is also what Moses experiences in the burning bush as the I am that I am. It's the ego. So Jehovah appears as this sort of this almost a compression of clairvoyance that turns inward and compresses into a central point within the Hebrew collective psyche as this divinity, a Yahweh. And then so that prepares the ground now for Moses, the coming of Moses, who reincarnates. Recall, he also has inherited the etheric body of Zarathustra, and then eventually Zarathustra will also reincarnate in Christ as his ego, not the astral or etheric body, but as his ego. So that's it for this lecture. Steiner's setting the stage now for a return back to the Matthew Gospel, which may not actually be for another couple of lectures, but we'll see how it goes here.